Welcome to Get Even. Get Even is the podcast where Even founders Ellen and Nora, that's me, sit down with incredible women who've been there, done that in the world of business. Get Even is your backstage pass to their lived experience. You'll hear raw insights, personal stories, and the realities of success. Whether you're looking for inspiration, practical advice, or a peek behind the curtain of what it really takes to thrive, this podcast is for women ready to go further. It's time to get even. Today's guest is Kylie Fuller. Some people talk about Kylie as the leadership whisperer, and you'll see why in this episode. Kylie is the founder of Fuller Potential. She was previously the Global Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at Macquarie Group, and she's held roles in organisations like the Reserve Bank of Australia, Telstra, Optus and Lendlease in the domains of leadership and diversity, equity and inclusion. You'll hear a lot in this conversation about key skills that all leaders must navigate, including the art of giving and receiving feedback. So this is a conversation for you if you find yourself getting defensive, perhaps, when receiving feedback, or if you're fearful of giving impactful feedback to people around you. We'll break down how to make these situations less intimidating and less scary. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Kylie, it's so nice to have you on Even. A huge welcome.
Thanks, Nora, and hello to the Even community.
I can't wait to hear more about your advice, your career journey, and I know it's going to be full of insight, this conversation, but let's just crack on with it. And I'd love to hear how you personally have approached career decisions over the years. So, what's been important to you and how did you weigh up? It can get really complicated if you're facing different options. How did you weigh up whether a role or an organization was right for you?
Well, Nora, I don't have much in common with Taylor Swift. She's a megastar billionaire with a private jet, and I'm not. But one thing we definitely have in common is career eras. So with the benefit of hindsight, I look back over my career and I can see some really distinct eras, and different things were important in each of these eras. I'll share a couple of examples. So as an undergrad, I studied commerce, but I knew right from the beginning that I was more interested in people than money. So I chose a major in human resources. So that one little decision had profound impacts because I've actually spent more than 30 years of my working life working in people and culture in one form or another. I graduated in the middle of a recession and there weren't a lot of great graduate roles to choose from, but there was this new startup company called Optus and they were looking for graduate talent. I know, hard to believe it was a startup with very few people. By the time I left, it had more than 10,000 staff. But Optus really suited me in the beginning because it was growing, it was fast paced, it was exciting and fun. It was the perfect place to be early career talent. And my career accelerated very fast in the beginning. And then I had children and everything changed overnight. So my priorities shifted enormously. So they went from being growth, acceleration, pace to flexibility, balance, and security, because I also got a mortgage at around the same time. So my career drivers changed and I was in the same organization. So really it was about communicating what I needed in order to be successful, in order to stay and continue to be able to contribute. So I see flexibility as something that's been incredibly important to me for a period of time. And then, of course, as my children got older and I was at a different stage, that was when I really hit my straps again. So after many years at Optus, I joined Lendlease. I'd become a specialist in leadership development at Optus, so I'd been working with leaders at all different levels. And the thing that attracted me to Lendlease was the opportunity to work on their leadership development programs. So they were fantastic programs with INSEAD and Korn Ferry. I knew that the business was in a period of growth. So at the time they were building Barangaroo, they were doing exciting projects all around the world. And so I was really attracted by the type of work and also the type of leaders that I would get to work with. That's also what attracted me to the RBA. So very different type of workforce, much more cerebral type of work, but leaders who have a profound impact. And so the opportunity to work with them, to develop them, to think about how that organization identifies talent and moves them around was really attractive to me. So those were some of my early moves. It was actually at Lendlease that I found my passion for diversity, equity and inclusion. So I was running residential leadership programs, and I would find that after dinner, there'd always be women, people from other underrepresented groups that would sidle up and have a chat and just talk about some of the additional challenges that they faced in their careers in the industry. And so it really lit a fire in me, and I became the chair of the Gender Equity Network. I joined their Diversity Council, and I became known for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I started to seek that out in the roles that I accepted. And I was fortunate enough that I then got headhunted for a couple of roles. So when I was at the RBA, I was approached by Telstra. They asked me to be their Global Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion. Of course, I had to go through a competitive selection process, but I was lucky enough to do that job for quite a few years. And then from there, I was approached by Macquarie Group to be their inaugural Global Head of DEI. So neither of those were easy decisions. I was happy in the roles that I'd been in, but because I was in this phase of growth and I recognized that, once I'd been at an organization for a couple of years, I'd probably had maximum impact. So the biggest difference I could make with what I do is early on. So that was what was exciting and important to me about those roles and why I took them. And interestingly enough, that's also why I started my own business. So I'm now in my founder era. I founded Fuller Potential. And really, that's about maximizing my impact and getting to work with people from different industries, different organizations, sharing the knowledge that I have gained over the years. So I'm very excited to do that. I'm just starting out, but I'm confident it's going to be an exciting era.
It's incredible. I love the framing of eras. And to me, it sounds like you've moved from sort of growth, acceleration to the era of flexibility and balance, and now to the era of impact, which I think they're actually they're pretty normal transitions to go through. But even the fact that you have that awareness of what's driving me in this era, I think is so important, because I see that that's where there can be sometimes misalignment. And also a lack of clarity in why are you choosing a role, or what are you seeking to get out of it. So it sounds like you're walking into your career with this degree of clarity. Is that right?
Look, I think it's easier with the benefit of hindsight. I don't think I set out to have those eras. I think that circumstances thrust them upon me. But certainly, I think adaptability is really key, and recognizing the stage you're in is important, and not being afraid to advocate for yourself. So if your priorities do shift and you need to communicate that in order to make the organization and the role work for you, it's really important to do that, because it's very easy to burn out in big organizations. So sometimes you really do have to reprioritize and recommunicate what's required for you to be successful.
That's such great advice. And I think it also, if I'm just paying attention to some of the language you used earlier, I think it aligns with when you said roles that you've accepted. So it's actually you're in the driving seat of your own career and the decisions that you make. And I love how you've just said you need to be clear around what works for you and clear in how you communicate that. I think that's a lesson as well. I think you're offering, without perhaps being explicit about it, but I'm receiving a sort of a bit of advice from you on that.
I think that's absolutely true. You don't have to take every opportunity that comes your way. And when you are going through a selection process, it's just as important to interrogate whether or not it feels like the right role for you, whether it's taking you in the direction that you want to go in. It's not just about proving that you could do the role, but it's about whether it's a role that is actually going to work for you.
Amazing. So, Kylie, I'd love to hear, you've already shared a bit about the significant roles that you've held with organizations like Macquarie Group, Telstra, the Reserve Bank of Australia, Lendlease and Optus. I mean, these are really large corporate environments, and the roles that you held were very influential roles. And I really would love for our community to benefit from your insight into those environments. And one of the questions that we often receive or challenges that we hear about is around how do you actually make an impact? How do you make yourself visible? And how can you stand out in these crowded corporate environments when there's 50,000 people, for example, in order to progress your career? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you've done it, or what do you recommend, what works well in order to really stand out as high potential talent.
Thanks, Nora. As head of DEI, one of the big parts of my role has always been to try and influence talent identification processes and to make them as objective and equitable as possible. And I would say my tip is to make sure that you're standing out for the right reasons. So it's one thing to want to be visible and want to stand out, but stand out for what? So be very clear about the value that you bring to your organization. What would they miss if you weren't there? What would you add to the leadership team if you were promoted into it? Most large organizations know that people are their most important asset, and they see succession planning for leadership roles as just a critical part of their annual cycle. So a lot of them do have an annual talent identification process where leaders sit down with HR, they look at the different people in the organization at different levels, and quite often they use a matrix. So on one axis of the matrix is performance, and on the other is potential. And always in these situations, we're pressed for time. As you said, there are a lot of people. We don't spend equal amounts of time talking about everybody. But one of the first things that they look for is performance and your most recent performance rating. And so my first tip for visibility is to make sure you're doing a great job in your current role. So if you're not achieving ratings that show that you're exceeding expectations in your current role, it's far less likely that you'll be seen as ready for the next level, capable of taking a more complex role or a leadership role. So one is value, two is high performance, and make sure that your value is clear.
Amazing. So it's almost a basic requirement is you must be doing your job well. And then it's like, what are the additional aspects? So how do you generate value, for example, that you can then start to talk about being identified as talent, or, you can start to talk about things like what's your potential for other contributions.
Absolutely. So that's the other the other axis on the matrix that I mentioned. So potential is challenging because it's quite hard to measure. Some organizations use learning agility as a bit of a proxy for potential. So it can be sort of code for leadership material or able to operate at that next level. So when you think about people in organization, there are some people who are exceptional high performers in their current roles. So they might be a technical expert, for example, an engineer or an accountant who has exceptional skill, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're good at dealing with complexity or managing people. So the other qualities that organizations are often looking for is adaptability, contribution to the success of the team. Do you coach and mentor others? Are you thinking more broadly than just about your own short-term impact? Do you think about the longer-term horizon? It might be things like relationships with customers. All of those things start to come into play. So as I said, baseline is do your current job well, but for the next level, you then need to be thinking about, well, what else do I bring? What other value do I have in the organization? How can I expand my impact and become more valuable and demonstrate that I would be valuable at the next level? The third thing is readiness. So some people have really high potential. So they're definitely seen as someone, a rising star, someone that's going to do big things, but maybe they're just not quite ready and they need a little bit of more time at level, just gaining the experience and the skills to grow. And that's also sometimes just about finding out some things that you need to work on before you get the visibility of being at the next level.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So that, I think, gives a great amount of insight into what goes on in terms of the processes that are in place for identifying somebody. But if you're on the other side, so if you're a woman and you're seeking to put yourself out there for your next step, what else do you recommend? So one of the things that I've heard about is you need to actually, for example, from other even experts, is you need to actually say that you want to prepare for your next step. You need to actually communicate these things to your leader, for example. Do you have any other advice for the individual?
Look, I think that's true. And I think, as I said, these processes and, even in smaller organizations where the processes are not as embedded, leaders are more likely to advocate for the people who've made their ambition or their aspiration clear. So if you're just quietly beavering away in the background, doing an awesome job of your role, people won't necessarily know that you aspire to a role at the next level. So I think communicating that to your leader is helpful. The other thing does come back a little bit more to visibility. So at the table, when there are people talking about you, it's helpful if more than one person is talking about you or can say, yes, I know them. They do a good job. Here's how I've experienced them. And that's often where it can be helpful to have a mentor or even a sponsor in an organization as well, because it's another voice, it's another advocate, another person who knows you and can speak up on your behalf and talk about the contribution that you're making. So if possible, having a broader network at that decision-making table can also be very helpful.
Amazing. Okay, now let's go back to some of the leadership skills that you outlined before. So there were a few around managing complexity. There was about, you mentioned some of the skills around leading a team, for example, or making sure that others are successful. What do you think should be really obvious in terms of the leadership skills that are required for somebody to progress in their career? And, it's a leadership skill that might seem like common sense, but it's often overlooked. Like, out of your list of leadership skills, what do you think?
For me, the number one thing is coachability and receptivity to feedback. So having sat in those conversations year after year, there are some people who get talked about and they are great technical experts, but they might have a derailer. And often it's something that they're not necessarily aware of, or they're aware of, but they're not making obvious efforts to remediate or to change the behavior. Sometimes it's a strength that we're overplaying. So I've quite often seen people who are very achievement oriented, results oriented, they push themselves very hard. But the thing that stops them from being great leadership material or top talent at the next level is they don't notice the impact that they're having on others, and they burn their teams out, or they put people offside, or they irritate their stakeholders. And sometimes they've been given that feedback multiple times, but the decision makers aren't really able to see an effort or a successful effort being made to shift the behavior. So I think that can sometimes change people's perception of your potential or your readiness for a next level role. So my number one tip is be coachable, be receptive to feedback, ask for feedback. And if you're getting feedback, really think about, okay, maybe I don't agree with this, but this is a perception that people have of me. So it's in my interest to think about what I can do to shift that behavior and shift that perception.
Yeah, that's such an important topic. And I want to stay with it for a minute, because I'm thinking about that moment when you know that the other person has feedback for you and you feel yourself getting defensive. Let's imagine I'm in that situation now. So I'm sitting with my leader, and like, what can I do for myself to overcome the defensiveness that I'm feeling? But also, what are some of the things that I could be saying to my leader in order to set us up well for receiving the constructive feedback? What could I be asking her?
Look, I think there are a couple of things when it comes to receiving feedback. One is, don't assume that it's easy for your leader to give you feedback, particularly constructive feedback. So you can make that simpler for everybody by asking for feedback. If you do get feedback that triggers a defense mechanism in you, that's perfectly normal and natural. So part of receiving feedback is that sometimes we don't agree with the feedback. See the feedback as a piece of data. It's a piece of information. You are now aware of how someone else is observing you in a way that you weren't before. Now, that can trigger defensiveness in you. It might be that you disagree with the feedback. It might be that you don't trust the person who gave it to you. Or it could be that actually it strikes a nerve with you, that it hits on something that's part of your identity. So either an aspect of your identity that you're aware of and you think, actually, that really hurts because, that's something that I'm worried that other people might see in me, or it might be that you just totally outright reject it and disagree with it. So if you are being triggered, just remember you don't have to react in the moment. It's okay just to say, thank you for letting me know. I'd like some time to think about that. Can we take it up in our next one-on-one? And actually go away and give yourself time to integrate the feedback, maybe even test it out with a couple of other people that you trust. try and find out whether it's something that other people observe in you as well. And if it is, and you do decide that it's something that you could work on, it's also okay to ask for help. So you can go back to your leader and say, look, thanks so much for letting me know. I was unconscious of that. Now that I know, I'd really like to work on it. Can you please let me know if you observe it in action? Can you give me some examples of where I could change that perception? Are there others who are aware of this? Is there something that I can do to help shift that perception as well?
So that sounds like it's a process of, first of all, thanking and acknowledging the leader for the feedback. Then I love the bit of advice around if it's threatening, give yourself a bit of space. I think that's a great one. And then I love the inviting others as well. So you're getting more data. And I love that it's a process of curiously you're seeking multiple sources of input. And then finally, you're kind of recruiting your leader to assist you, and in the process they might be becoming an even bigger advocate or sponsor, because you've made them part of developing you on that specific thing that they identified. I'm just wondering, is there anything else that you could be doing?
Well, look, I think by being receptive to feedback and acting on it, you actually open the door to get more feedback as well. So that might be a hard thing. But one thing to be aware of as women, particularly in male dominated organizations and industries where sometimes our leaders are men, it can be really difficult, more difficult for them to give you feedback than it is for them to give feedback to other men. So they might be more cautious and more considered in the way that they give feedback. So what we sometimes see in proteges or people who are being sponsored in organization is that influential senior leaders almost see like a younger version of themselves in certain talent. And so they are bolder and braver about saying, here's something you need to work on in order to succeed at the next level. And so on the one hand, if you're looking for visibility, if you're asking for access to a senior leader, that is a good thing. But it also does come with that double-edged sword that you're opening the door to hear some things that maybe you don't want to hear. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is look for other evidence of the way that you're being perceived in the organisation. So we talk about intention versus impact, and the human tendency is to judge ourselves on our intention and others on their impact. So it can be quite a useful skill to learn to judge yourself or calibrate your own performance on your impact. And if we go back to Taylor Swift, I mean, think about why she's so successful. She knows her audience. She sings about things they care about. She knows which songs are chart toppers. When she's at a concert, she sees which songs make them dance and make them cry. Does more of the things that work and less of the things that don't work. And so I think that can be quite an interesting way of looking at yourself as the way that you operate within an organization. What's landing well? What's not landing so well? What should I be doing more of and less of? Obviously within the context of continuing to do your job. So that self-awareness, awareness of impact, I think is incredibly important.
Incredible. We actually talk about this a lot on Even as well, just that experimentation. So trying a specific behavior, a specific habit, a specific way of asking a question or speaking up and seeing if it increases your impact. And if it doesn't, then you tweak it. But I love just the reference there to Taylor Swift, is like we all have to see every meeting, every interaction as an opportunity to experiment and to see what works, what doesn't. But I do think then that requires a degree of, like you said, you have to really open yourself up to also being honest about when it didn't work, and you have to actually build in that habit of reflection as well, when sometimes it's just easier to gloss over something that didn't go so well and to kind of continue being defensive and make it the other person's problem rather than anything that you might have done. So I think it's how do you think about making more space for that mode where you can be reflective and you can be honest about, did my intent actually match my impact? How do you do that?
Some of it, I think, is about cultivating relationships and cultivating trust. So it's helpful to have people you trust in the workplace, people you can ask for a second opinion. So I've been very fortunate throughout my career to have had peers and trusted managers, and really to cultivate that kind of connection where you can say, I've been told this. Is there an element of truth to that? Is that something that you think I need to be aware of? But interestingly, sometimes feedback comes from unexpected sources, and it can be, it can really cut at the time, but it can be something that you remember for a long time. So I remember getting feedback once in a 360-degree feedback tool that told me that sometimes I had a bit of negativity bias and I could come across as overly critical or negative. Now, that came from someone I didn't particularly like or trust. It was a very transparent 360 feedback degree. And at the time, I was really cranky about it. And I thought, wow, that really bugs me. But I took it as data and I thought, well, okay, well, if one person thinks that, there's a reasonable chance that other people might think that. I tested it with others, and there were a few people who said, yeah, look, you can sometimes, come across as, being a little bit negative about things. And so I became aware of that, and I really actively worked on improving that. And what I found that not only was that the case in my professional life, but also my private life. So it's something that has stood me in good stead. That thing that I initially railed against has actually become something that's helped me to become a better person in lots of different ways.
Yeah. So there are real benefits in both your professional and your personal life, and actually really sitting with the feedback and listening to it and reflecting on it. It's making me think about a time when I had 360 feedback early on in my career, which at the time, so I can be quite task focused, and the feedback was really around the degree of warmth. So I was in a leadership role already, but I was kind of being primed for a more senior role. And there was very much the feedback of, you're going to have to really think about the level of warmth that you exhibit with people if you want to progress. And you could talk about, is that a gendered concept as well? But it actually has really changed how I think about what matters as a leader. It's not about getting the task done, because as a leader, it's actually all about relationships. But it took a few years to really shift that mindset from doing to the leading. So that was feedback that was really crucial and important for me. But I have also had feedback over the course of my career that has been feedback where I knew instinctively, and then knew through testing it with others, that the feedback was unfair, or was more about the other person, or was sort of a personal attack. I'm just wondering, what advice do you have for the women listening to our podcast and on the Even community, when you've substantiated through data that you're getting feedback that's actually not helpful? What do you do then?
I think it comes back to what we said. It's really about receiving the feedback as one piece of data. It's like, okay, that's information. Is there validation of that? Is this just coming from one source? Do I trust that source? What do I think is their motivation for giving me that feedback? And really reflecting on it yourself. I think there are times when the intention behind the feedback or the motivation for giving it is not pure. And so it's okay to be cynical about some feedback. You also have to think about where that feedback is coming from, and whether or not the person giving it is a decision maker who's going to have influence over your career. So I would say there are a lot of things to think about if you don't agree with feedback that you're given, or if you think it's unfair. And I think the most important thing in that case is to give yourself time to respond to it. So try not to respond in the moment with anger, with justification and defensiveness. Take it on board as a data point, and then give yourself some time to reflect on it, and just to simmer down as well, because when our emotions are triggered, we're not always in the best frame of mind to have the conversation. So there's nothing wrong with just saying, thank you, can we talk about this at another time?
Yeah. Beautiful. Okay. And what about the other side of it? So that skill of giving feedback well, I'm sure you've done it. You've also, in your roles, whether it's with leadership or with leading DEI, I'm sure you would have seen great practices and some not so great practices for giving feedback. What's your advice for how to do it well?
I think the best advice is to be as specific as possible and make sure the feedback is example based, that it's about a specific situation rather than about the person. So I try to make sure that I never give feedback that is personal and unchangeable. So for example, saying to someone you're aggressive or you're too task focused is a good example. So rather than saying you're overly task focused, you could say, I noticed in our last sprint that you set some really ambitious task objectives, and while you were very motivated by that, I noticed that others in the team actually looked a little bit intimidated, and some of them said to me afterwards that they feel like we've bitten off more than we could chew. So the impact of setting such an ambitious task target is that others are feeling somewhat intimidated, and they're less motivated and more nervous about our ability to achieve that. Notice that I was using I language there as well. So talking about I noticed this or I observed that rather than you do this and you do that. So you want to try and make sure that your tone is never accusatory and that you're giving really clear, specific examples. This was the situation. This was the behavior I observed. This was the impact I observed as well. So it's a tried and true model. SBI, situation, behavior, impact, comes by many other names, but definitely learning to construct feedback is a critical part of giving effective feedback.
And what's interesting is just being on the receiving end of that example was very interesting, because you started off with how the feedback was delivered at the time, which is you're too task focused. So that's like that's a comment on your person and how you are. And immediately I was like, oh, but then when you changed it to noticed in that sprint, so it's really specific. And then when you got to how others are feeling, when you said others are not feeling motivated, even though this is now, we're not talking about a real example anymore, I was going, I don't want that to be the outcome. I want my team to be motivated. So straight away, it totally made me buy into, like, here's why this feedback matters. Here's why it's important. Whereas had you just left it at you're too task focused, I would have just gone, nah, easy to ignore, easy to argue with. So I think it's a beautiful way to have done it.
Yeah, I think the intention behind giving it as well. In that example, if my intention is to help you become more effective in your role, to become a better leader and get the most out of your team, which, by the way, is how you get most work done as a leader. So lots of people are very task-oriented or very achievement and results-oriented. But if you think about the role of leaders is to get work done through others and to amplify their impact by making others successful, actually by framing feedback and giving it with the intention of helping them to grow and helping them to be successful, that can help it land in the right way. So I think that's incredibly important.
Can I also be honest about when you're a leader and when you know that you have to give some feedback that might be difficult to digest for the person? How do you psych yourself up? Like, what's the mental prep that you do?
For me, I think about how can I be of service to this person? How can I frame this feedback in a way that is going to help them understand that I'm giving it with the intention of helping them to be successful and helping them to improve their performance and their career prospects. So it's really thinking about that rapport that I want to build with the person. How well do I know them? Do they trust me? Have I given them appropriate amounts of positive feedback for the things that they're doing well? So I'm not a believer in the feedback sandwich. I think we all know that that one's been debunked. But as a leader, you do want to be making sure that you're giving an appropriate balance of positive and constructive feedback. So give credit where it's due, let people know very specifically when they're doing a good job and what was good about it. And I think that does build the trust and it builds that receptivity. If people only hear from you when it's bad news or you've got something negative to say, then they do become distrustful and they don't necessarily think that your motives are positive. So I think as a leader, you try and see these things as a long-term relationship and you get the balance throughout and make sure that you have that trust and rapport. Now, that's easy to say. I'm sure that there are some members of your even community who are listening to this thinking, well, that's all well and good, but actually I don't have a great rapport with my manager and I don't necessarily trust them. So I think, we need to think about what role can we play in that as well. So how do we make an effort to find common ground with the people around us, whether that's our leader or project manager or whoever that is? How do we focus on the positive, focus on the common ground, focus on our shared goals? So even if you don't feel a natural affinity with a person, you might have an outcome that you're trying to achieve together. So how can we try and work positively together towards that goal? How can we make sure there's mutual value in the way that we are communicating with one another?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice call out, because we don't have to like everyone we work with. We don't have to be friends with them, but we can actually still have a really productive and respectful relationship where we, again, coming back to intention, where we realize that even though the person might be very different from us and may not be our personal cup of tea if it were for a friendship, but we could actually still see their positive intention and see that we're working towards a shared goal. I think that's probably a whole other session we should be doing together, is how do you work with people you're not really getting on with, which is also something that we do hear about a lot.
Yeah, I think having challenging conversations it's a whole other topic, but it's a really important one. And the reality is that in any organization, there will be people who are your cup of tea and people who aren't. And so I've seen people change roles or change organizations to get away from a particular person. But, sure enough, at the next organization, there'll be another person who isn't their cup of tea. So I think you need to be really careful about making big decisions based on just one or two people that you have a difficult relationship with.
That's really good advice. And it's, I'm just thinking about it's really hard in practice, and I love it. Okay, so let's think about broader career advice, Kylie, around, you've actually given us so much insight already, but is there any other career advice that I'm thinking specifically about women who are earlier on in their career journeys? What else would you want them to know based on the experience that you've had?
I think that change is always a little bit scary. And so there are times when you might feel nervous about something, and that's really a reaction to the uncertainty or the unknowns about the change. Often people are told, listen to your gut, listen to your instincts. And I think that can be good advice. But I think there are also times when your instinct is being driven by a fear of uncertainty. And so really ask yourself if that's what's showing up here. And I heard a great bit of advice, which was the opposite of uncertainty isn't certainty, it's self-belief. And so if you believe in your own ability to adapt and to become more certain or more confident over time, then you're more likely to try things out or to take risks. I found that a really good piece of advice, and I'm happy to pass that on.
I love that. It also reminds me of sometimes when people talk about confidence or self-belief, they misunderstand it as something that's about being sort of loud or being out there. But it's exactly what you've just said. It's sort of the ability that we'll be able to cope, and we have the capability to cope with whatever life or career might throw our way.
And we're both founders of new businesses, Nora, so I'm sure it's something that we both relate to at the moment, that there is uncertainty. There are some things that are a little bit intimidating about starting your own business. But if you think about all the millions of new businesses that have been started throughout the course of human history, people have had to take that leap of faith. They've had to back themselves to try and do something new. So nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Exactly. Wow. That's really good framing. I love that. And I'll keep that close to my heart as well, for every bit of uncertainty that we'll face in our journey. Okay, so I want to finish on women. You've made such an impact in the roles that you've had on supporting women, and we both know that women don't need to be fixed, but we do know that there are issues that are sometimes structural, they can be cultural, they can be organizational, that still prevent us from participating to our fullest economic potential. But as somebody who's led the efforts for diversity, equity, and inclusion at organizations like Macquarie Group and Lendlease, what do you think needs to happen in order to realize women's economic potential?
Oh my gosh, I could do a whole nother podcast on this. Look, the first one came up early on, flexibility. I do think flexibility is key for women's economic empowerment, but it can't just be flexibility for women. And we don't want flexibility to be associated with a short-term thing that we grant temporarily to mothers of young children so that they can stay in the workforce. I think organisations need to think about all of their employees, particularly those with caring responsibilities of any gender, and make flexibility available. So flexibility in households is definitely part of the story. So we can't just have flexibility at work and not at home. Another thing which I've really worked hard to challenge is changing our perception of the ideal worker and even that way that we think about potential. So historically, perception of the ideal worker has been someone who looks and sounds a lot like those who've been successful before. So we have that, whether or not we're aware of it, we have that mental template of what good looks like. And for a long time, that was people who were just always available. They arrived early, they stayed late, they worked hard, they had good relationships within the business. All of those things have been incredibly important. The challenge with that is not everyone can equally look and sound like that template of the ideal worker. There are just things that are outside of their control that make it much harder for them to be seen in that same way. And I think the current disruption is actually helping us to bust that up. And so increasingly, it's less about hours worked and things like that. We're going to have AI soon to do a lot of those tasks. It's like, well, what is our new definition of high potential look like? How do we make sure that we're not just thinking about the individual, but the perspective that they bring to the team? So if we think about a leadership team as a really good example, if we have a whole team of leaders with a similar background, similar experience, similar perspectives, then we could be missing really significant innovation, problem-solving ability, etc. And so I'd love organisations, cultures, even politicians. We've seen it in recent times in the voting decisions that people make. People are keen to have leaders and decision makers who reflect the communities and the customers that they serve. So I'd love organisations to do a better job of that, to think more expansively about what high potential and leadership and all of those things, that those capabilities come in very different packages, and there's huge value in having people who bring those differences to the table.
Wow. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's a beautiful summary of some of the things that are needed. So important. And I'm with you. I am hopeful that we're seeing some changes in our organizations reflecting the communities that they're serving, but still a long way to go. But I'm very hopeful. Kylie, I want to thank you.
Too.
That's good. Well, we need to be in order to be doing this line of work, because otherwise, why would you if you don't have hope?
Exactly. I think it's important to be optimistic, but recognise that we still do have a long way to go. It's interesting. We're starting to hear this narrative that DEI has gone too far. And I find that so interesting because there's very little data that bears that out. In fact, most of the data tells us that we still have a long way to go. So yes, I think we just have to stay optimistic and just keep building.
Yes, hope, and roll up our sleeves and get it done.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, sharing your wisdom. We're very lucky to have you. Thanks, Kylie.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm Dr. Nora Koslowski, co-founder of Even, where our mission is to accelerate women's economic potential. Check out even-careers.com to learn how we support women and business to get even.